not spending enough money on it. We're not spending enough money on it. We're not spending enough money on it. We're not spending enough money on it.
All right, let's. As this is all happening, it's it really does feel like, you know. I watched a little bit of Morning Joe this morning because I was just curious. I know it's first time in ever, and
We're not spending enough money on it.
it is. But it's fascinating to see all these things
That is
sort of line up.
Yeah, they're
okay. I mean,
converging.
because
Yeah.
they spent the whole day talking about the shutdown, and they're mocking in the same way that we have Donald Trump and Wilbur Ross and Larry Kudlow, trying to seem like they have actual warm blood flowing through their veins.
We're not spending enough money on it.
Like the millennials.
But then the story that is coming out of Davos, the main story is the critique of Davos at this point, at least in what's in the, and Davos has been sort of out of
We're not spending enough money on it.
the news for the past couple of cycles. And part of it is that there's this critique out there, and they've let people into the building on some level where the critique is. And here is an exchange, and this is just a stunning exchange for multiple reasons. She is chironed here as an economics correspondent for the Washington Post. Now, I just want everybody to sort of sit with that for a moment and imagine what the baseline knowledge of the United States economy and just the things like the history of the economy, basic stuff, basic, just knowledge of how the tax system works, just very basic overview. She is doing this panel. On it is this guy, is Michael Dell from Dell Computers, right? Mm-hmm. And this guy from MIT named Eric Brynjolfsson. He is the director of MIT's initiative on the digital economy. And so here's the exchange. She asks a question. They get a big laugh because the idea of actual, tax regime is hilarious. But listen to where this goes.
There are growing calls to address these inequalities, particularly the wage inequality, with more taxes. In particular, in the United States, there's been a call by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez to tax people earning over $10 million at a 70% tax rate. The current top rate in the United States is 37%. Michael Dell, do you support this?
I just want to say I'm thrilled that they're asking.
Wow. Well, look, so no, I'm not supportive of that.
Well, Keith.
And I don't think it would help the growth of the U.S. economy.
Oh, that's interesting. And can you say a little bit more about why? Why you don't think it would?
Well, name a country where that's worked, ever.
United States.
Briefly, in the 80s.
No.
All right, pause it for a second. No, pause it for a second. First off, but wait a second. So fortunately, they have I guess you need to be a professor at MIT to know this. But go.
Of the U.S. economy.
Oh, that's interesting. And can you say a little bit more about why? Why you don't think it would?
Well, name a country where that's worked, ever.
United States.
Briefly, in the 80s.
No. From about the 1930s through about the 1960s, the tax rate averaged about 70%. At times, it was up as high as 95%. And those were actually pretty good years for growth. So I don't have a strong opinion on that proposal. A lot of the devil is in the details. But I think there's actually a lot of economics that suggests that it's not necessarily going to hurt growth.
Yeah. I mean,
We're not spending enough money on it.
Dutch. All right, here is the exchange.
From New Jersey.
And it's interesting to look at. I don't know who the other panelists are, but they're all like, wait a second. Nobody likes to have one of those comments that indicts everybody for being on stage.
This is my first time at Davos, and I find it quite a bewildering experience, to be honest. I mean, 1,500 private jets have flown in here to hear Sir David Attenborough speak about, how we're wrecking the planet. And I hear people talk in the language of participation and justice and equality and transparency. But then, I mean, almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? And of the rich just not paying their fair share. I mean, it feels like I'm at a firefighters conference and no one's allowed to speak about water, right? there was only one panel, actually.
Well, we've had two. You're the second of our panelists.
There was only one panel.
Let's go there.
One panel hidden away in the media center that was actually tax avoidance. Yeah. I was one of the 15 participants. So something needs to change here. I mean, 10 years ago, the World Economic Forum asked the question, what must industry do to prevent a broad social backlash? The answer is very simple. Just stop talking about philanthropy and start talking about taxes. Taxes. We need to, I mean, just 2 days ago, there was a billionaire in here, what's his name? Michael Dell. And he asked the question like, name me one country where a top marginal tax rate of 70% has actually worked. And, you know, I'm a historian. The United States, that's where it has actually worked. In the 1950s, during Republican President Eisenhower, the war veteran, the top marginal tax rate in the US was 91% for people like Michael Dell. The top estate tax for people like Michael Dell was more than 70%. I mean, this is not rocket science. I mean, we can talk for a very long time about all these stupid philanthropy schemes. We can invite Bono once more, but come on, we got to be talking about taxes. Yeah, exactly. That's it, taxes. All the rest is bullshit, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Yes, enjoy your last time at Davos. I mean, it's obvious. It's a lot shorter conference if that's the only panel that you have, right? Which is the one which talks about tax avoidance and basically these schemes in which to roll back taxes.
And they don't get to self-aggrandize about all the philanthropy and foundations as Michael Dell did in his first breath after that question was asked of him.
While he was justifying tax avoidance. I mean, there's net exit of capital from Africa because of tax avoidance schemes that cancels all of the because they love the Africa savior complex.
But if you buy a cow for a local business person in Africa, that'll change it.
Yeah, Michael Dell's like, I'd much prefer to buy a cow for someone in Malawi than be taxed.
A lot of malaria
I feel
nets.
a lot more comfortable with that.
There was also a massive report that came out just, I think, at the beginning of this week, probably timed for Davos, which showed that a very, very strong correlation between companies that have donated to nonprofits and those nonprofits turning around and advocating for deregulatory practices on those companies, just willy-nilly.
Really?
I know that's very shocking to you. I hope we haven't ruined any of your illusions.
I know. I'm a mere 24, but I still am as cynical, I feel like, as everyone at the table. So
it's a little sad. It's a little sad.
Hey, there's a polar vortex coming over the Midwest. Who do you think's responsible? I don't know, maybe.
And it is like negative 50 degrees in the Dakotas right now. What would happen if Russia killed the power in Fargo today?
What if a Muslim terrorist wants to blow up buildings in America? And what if they do it on a really cold day and you have to stand outside because the building is destroyed and you just cranked up your heat to 86 so you're wearing shorts? What happens then? I love what Maya says. Maya says a top-rated daily news show has spent close to 2 years now devoting a majority of its airtime to proof my assertion and arguments, proponing a xenophobic conspiracy theory calculated to benefit a political party. Nothing amiss there, right? Yeah, very well said, Maya. Very well said. And let me just say, this is from one show. I've played this before. This is from one show. Someone put this together. People over at the news something.com. And here we go. Ready? Here we go.
Russia, Vladimir Putin, Russia, hates Russia, Putin, Russia, Moscow, Russia, Russian, pro-Russian, Russian, the Russians, Russian, Moscow, Russia, Putin, Russian, against us, Russians, Rush against the U.S., the Russians, Russian government scheme. The Russians, Vladimir Putin, Russia. Vladimir Putin, Putin and Russia. Russia, Moscow, Russia. Russia. The Russians. Russian, Putin. Russia. The Soviet Empire. The second of the 20th century's great evils, communism. Russia.
Communism.
Russia. Assault by Russia. Russia's.
Putin despises the West in general and the United States in particular, the Soviet Empire. Russia. They're the adversary. They want to bring us down, the Soviet Union.
Russia.
Undermine the West, Soviet communists on the left.
Russia. That does it for us tonight. We will see you again tomorrow.
And believe it or not, that program was about Sweden.
We're not spending enough money on it.
However, the highest PV cell efficiency ever achieved was 46% and was collaboratively developed by a handful of teams out of France and Germany in 2014. And they achieved this by creating a multi-junction solar cell using multiple materials. And by doing this, the multinational team was able to capture a greater portion of sunlight. And for multi-junction cells, the maximum theoretical efficiency is 87%. For now, multi-junction cells are only practical for very specialized uses like Mars rovers. They're too costly for mass production, but hopefully breakthroughs in the future will change that. Another emerging technology in solar energy is organic photovoltaic cells, or OPVs. OPVs are made from hydrocarbon materials, namely plastics. Organic photovoltaic cells are more environmentally friendly to make compared to silicon-based cells. You see, silicon is made from quartz, which is heated in a furnace, emitting sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Additionally, OPVs, being plastic, are flexible and can be used on curved structures, along with various items such as backpacks. OPV technology is starting to leave the lab and make its way to actual projects. In 2017, the French company Engie installed the largest OPV system, measuring 530 square meters on top of a school. The experimental system has an efficiency of around 13% and produces around 24 megawatt hours per year, which accounts for around 15 to 20% of the school's power needs. But it appears that efficiencies in OPV cells are starting to catch up to commercial silicon PV cells. Researchers from the University of China developed an OPV cell with an efficiency of 17.3% by incorporating an incredible tandem cell system. Similar to a multi-junction PV cell, the university's cell captures multiple wavelengths of light by using devices built within the same cell structure. This was an incredible advancement from China.
Our next guest is an old friend of mine, Bruce Bartlett, who, among other things, was a Treasury official in the George H.W. Bush administration and was part of the economics team for the Reagan White House. He was one of the authors of Supply-Side Economics, is a super experienced economic policymaker, and has become recently a big critic of supply-side economics, which he believed at the time in the late 70s, early 80s was appropriate, but now believes is completely bogus and mismatched for the economic circumstances of our day. Bruce also knows more about tax policy than any single person I've ever met and has a great book out on the tax system that everybody should read called The Benefit and the Burden, which gives you a real picture of the form and function of the American tax system and what we could do to improve it. In any case, Bruce is an awesome guy and a truth teller and has gotten in a lot of trouble himself for being transparent and willing to confront some of his friends and allies.
Hi, Bruce. How are you?
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Why don't we just start off by kind of a general question about what your role was in the Reagan administration and your role in the Reagan tax cuts?
My role in the Reagan tax cuts started back in the 1970s. I had gotten a job on Capitol Hill working for Ron Paul, who was defeated the same year I went to work for him, 1976. And this led me to look for another job, and I found one working for Jack Kemp, a former professional football player who represented the Buffalo suburbs in New York. And he was very interested in the tax issue, and he put me to work basically on developing that interest. And in 1977, he asked me to draft a bill that would duplicate the Kennedy tax cut of the early 1960s, and it was known as the Kemper-Roth bill. Ronald Reagan endorsed it in his run for the White House, and when he got elected, he sent that legislation to Capitol Hill, and it was enacted into law in August of 1981. And then in 1987, I went to work in the Office of Policy Development at the White House, and I worked there for 2 years, and then went over to the Treasury Department, where I worked throughout the George H.W. Bush administration.
Okay, so you were there at the beginning then, at the creation of the response to what was going on economically, and what was so different in the 70s? What was happening then versus what's going on now? What made you think that tax cuts were the way to go?
The most important difference between then and now is inflation. We had a lot of inflation. And I think people today, many young people have never experienced anything like an inflationary environment. And many people my age have forgotten about it. But it really riveted politicians' attention the way no other economic issue really has since the 1930s. And one of the effects of inflation was to push people up into higher tax brackets. And indeed, taxes were rising very, very rapidly, very substantially, actually mainly for average people. Because if you think about it, if a rich person is already in the top tax bracket, they have no higher brackets to be pushed into, you see. So the effect of what was called bracket creep was largely on average people.
And so the thinking was then what? Why was it going to be such a great solution to high inflation to cut taxes? What was the thinking?
Jack Kemp believed that inflation was essentially a monetary phenomenon, and he supported a tight money policy by the Federal Reserve, but he was concerned that tight money would cause the economy to slow down, and it did. It caused a big recession in 1980 and another in 1981, and he thought that a tax cut would help cushion the blow and help keep the economy going as it transitioned from high inflation to low inflation. He also thought that inflation was, in a sense, too much money chasing too few goods and services. So if a tax cut led to an increase in the production of goods and services, then it would be anti-inflationary.
And one of the things that we forget about the Reagan era is that taxes actually were raised later. So what was the story with that?
Well, after the 1981 tax cut, everybody was suddenly had their attention focused on the budget deficit. And Reagan supported a big tax increase in 1982 called the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act that raised taxes by 1% of GDP, which was a very large tax increase. And he supported 10 other tax increases in the subsequent years of his administration. And by 1988, he had enacted tax increases that took back half of the 1981 tax cut. So he was perfectly willing to support higher revenues to bring the deficit down, and that's, of course, a big difference between him and today's Republicans, who will never support 1 penny of tax increase for any reason whatsoever.
Yeah, so that's really become the dogma, and you, of course, were kind of there at the creation of that dogma, and I think a little bit about other people have maybe renounced dogma, like Robert McNamara in the Vietnam War, or others who've been so famous for renouncing. Talk to me a little bit about what brought you to be in a different place around tax cuts in this era, in the George W. Bush era. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, the transition for me began in November of 2003. That was when the Republican Party, to which I was then comfortably a member of, enacted the Medicare Part D program, which was a huge unfunded entitlement program. Now, I never had any problem with adding prescription drugs to the Medicare program. I just thought it was grossly irresponsible to pass this legislation without a penny of financing. It was just all on the national credit card, a big increase in the budget deficit. And I naively thought that Republicans were opposed to deficits in those days.
They talked a big game about that. They still do. What happened?
Yeah, well, the truth is they're rank hypocrites and liars.
I was waiting for you to say that. Thank you. Okay.
Well, actually, what I've learned over the years is that Republicans actually love deficits because they love talking about deficits. They love using deficits as an excuse to slash programs for the poor and the middle class. That's why they cut taxes whenever there's the hint of getting control of the deficit. For example, we had huge budget surpluses at the end of the 1990s. The Republicans just pissed all that away with huge tax cuts that did nothing whatsoever to stimulate the economy. And, of course, they've done the same thing in 2017. And so what I call this is something called starve the beast, which is a Republican theory that the only way you can cut spending is by having deficits so large that there is no other choice. So Republicans, their policy is to intentionally create large deficits through tax cuts, use those deficits as an excuse to slash benefits for the poor and middle class. When the deficits come down, they simply enact more tax cuts and start the process all over again. And basically they will continue this until there's nothing left of the safety net, till government does absolutely nothing except national defense.
And that sounds like a pretty important piece of truth-telling. What happened when you started saying things like this?
Well, what I realized immediately is that deficits were going to get so large that taxes would have to be increased. I didn't foresee the determination of Republicans to avoid any tax whatsoever, and I thought that they would be forced into being responsible. And I was, at the time, very strongly opposed to a tax increase, so I felt that the Republican policy was contrary to Republican policy, that they were going to bring about a tax increase. That didn't really work out, but it did open my eyes, I think, to the utter hypocrisy of the party I belong to. And what happened is I sort of started seeing the glass as half empty rather than half full, and having broken with my party on this one issue, I gradually began breaking with them on lots of other issues. And by 2006, I publicly declared myself to be an independent and no longer a member of the Republican Party. And I wrote a book highly critical of George W. Bush. And honestly, at the time, I thought I was just the first guy out of the gate, and that lots of other conservatives and libertarians who felt like I did about the budget and deficits and things like that would follow me out the door. And I was shocked when nobody followed me out the door.
So when you called the president an imposter, people don't follow you out the door? Is that what you found?
Well, I did think Bush was an imposter by pretending to be a conservative. I thought he was a terrible, I don't want to say liberal, but he was certainly not a fiscal conservative. He, as I said, had huge deficits. If we had simply kept budget policy on automatic pilot where it was in January 2001 when Bush took office, by the time he left office, we would have literally paid off the national debt. But in fact, the national debt doubled. And it's a source of deep frustration to me that the major media still treat the Republicans as if they are the party of fiscal responsibility, when in fact all of the evidence of the last 20-some years is exactly the opposite. I mean, the only presidents who have really reduced the deficit are Clinton and Obama. Bush and Trump have vastly increased it, yet you cannot get the media to focus on this and talk about the truth of the matter, they still have this notion that the Democrats are the wild-eyed spenders and the Republicans are the sober budget balancers. It's just an utter nonsense.
And what would it take to change that? You have a pretty stiff critique of the Democratic Party as well. What needs to be in place to really shift and myth bust? Because as you point out, they're really hypocrites when it comes to spending. What would it take?
Well, I think Democrats should stop being tax collectors for the Republican tax cuts. I think that what has been missing in public policy since 1989 is a strong and vocal left socialist liberal movement in this country that could pull the Democratic Party to the left the same way the Tea Party and the many, many different organizations on the right funded by the Kochs and other rich billionaires that pull the Republican Party to the right. I think what's happened is that both parties have moved to the right, and the Democrats have stayed relatively as far to the left of the Republicans as they've always been. It's just that because the Republicans are further right, they're now not really on the objective left at all. They're in the center.
Right. Do you have any advice for people out there who might be wanting to be truth tellers themselves but are worried about becoming pariahs? What have you learned over the years?
Well, all I can say is things change, okay? I mean, when I was young, one of the reasons I joined the conservative movement, the Republican Party, is because the left, the progressive movement, the Democratic Party was dominant. I mean, we were coming out of the Great Society. We had huge big government programs and high taxes, and the media was truly quite liberal. But that has all changed. It's now 180 degrees opposite. The right is now in a very dominant position in the media and in government. And the only thing I can say is if it changed once in one direction, it can change again back into another direction. I would point to the 1880s in American history when the robber barons and so on were very, very powerful, and the politics were very similar to those of today. But that was followed by the progressive era and a movement back in the other direction. So I think, we're overdue for realignment.
And we're glad that you're there storming the barricades with the rest of us. We really appreciate it. I really appreciate your joining us today and your perspective and your willingness to talk about times past and what's going on in the present. And I look forward to talking to you again.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
One of the sad but amusing sort of natural experiments that unfolded in our country over the last 10 years was Kansas Governor Sam Brownback's famous trickle-down experiment.
And he was swept into office in 2010 with a simple promise to provide, quote, a shot of adrenaline into the heart of the Kansas economy. An unfortunate metaphor borrowed from Pulp Fiction, where he's a coked-up hitman and Kansas is a junkie who's ODing on the floor.